If you have blonde hair, you probably think you know where it came from. Northern Europe, right? Scandinavia, the Baltic, maybe a Viking somewhere in the family tree. That is the story almost everyone assumes, and it is almost entirely wrong. The real origin of blonde hair does not begin in Sweden or Norway or anywhere in Western Europe at all. It begins thousands of kilometers to the east, in the frozen interior of Siberia, carried by people who never saw the Baltic Sea and who lived more than 10,000 years before the first farmer ever set foot on the European continent. That is not speculation. It is written directly into ancient DNA, and once you understand how it got from there to here, blonde hair stops looking like a simple regional trait and starts looking like one of the strangest long-distance journeys in human genetics. Start with how rare this trait actually is on a planetary scale. Naturally, blonde hair is found in only a small fraction of the world's population, generally estimated at around 2% globally, concentrated overwhelmingly in Northern and Eastern Europe, with a much smaller, genetically unrelated pocket on the other side of the planet that we will get to later. That scarcity alone should raise a question. If blonde hair offers no obvious survival advantage, why does it exist at all, and why does it cluster so tightly in specific regions rather than spreading evenly across humanity the way some traits do? The answer is not really about Northern Europe. It is about a single small mutation that appeared far away, carried by a population most people have never heard of, and then swept into Europe on the back of a migration that reshaped the entire continent's gene pool. For most of human history, there was no blonde hair anywhere on Earth. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa with dark hair and dark eyes, the product of high melanin production suited to intense equatorial sun. As populations spread north into lower UV environments, pigmentation genes began loosening their grip. But the specific genetic switch that produces blonde hair did not exist yet. It had to be invented, in a sense, by a random mutation in one population, at one point in time, in one place. Genetics can now tell us roughly where and when that happened, and the location is almost never what people expect. The gene most responsible for common European blonde hair is called KITLG, short for KIT ligand, a gene that in its ordinary form has nothing to do with hair color at all. It plays roles in a wide range of biological processes, including how certain cells migrate to their correct locations during development. The mutation that produces blonde hair is not even inside the working part of the gene. It sits in a nearby regulatory region, a stretch of DNA whose job is to control when and how strongly the gene switches on. Researchers identified a single-letter change at this site, a variant known as RS12821256, that behaves like a dimmer switch rather than an on-off switch. It slightly weakens the site where a protein called LEF1 normally binds and activates the gene. With a weaker binding site, LEF1 cannot switch on KITLG as strongly inside developing hair follicles, and the result is roughly a 20% reduction in the gene's activity, specifically in the hair, not the skin, and not the eyes. Less KITLG activity in the follicle means less eumelanin gets deposited into growing hair, and the strands come out lighter, ranging from pale gold to near white depending on how the trait combines with other pigmentation genes. This is already a clue to why blonde hair behaves the way it does across families. It is not that the color pigment disappears entirely, the way it can in true albinism. It is that one specific production line, tucked into one specific tissue, gets turned down. The mutation is precise, almost to the point of being surgical, affecting hair color while leaving skin and eye pigmentation largely untouched, which is part of why blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin are genetically separate traits that happen to travel together in certain populations, rather than being one single package controlled by one single gene. So where did this dimmer switch mutation first appear? Ancient DNA gives a surprisingly specific answer. The oldest known individual carrying this blonde hair variant is not a Scandinavian farmer or a Viking-era skeleton. It is a specimen from a site called Afontova Gora in southern Siberia, dated to roughly 17,000 years ago. This individual belonged to a population geneticists now call ancient North Eurasians, a group that lived deep in the interior of the Eurasian landmass, long before agriculture existed anywhere, and long before most of the population movements that shaped modern Europe had even begun. Ancient North Eurasians were themselves a genetic bridge population, carrying a blend of ancestry connected to both western and eastern branches of the human family tree, and they left a genetic fingerprint that would later show up, diluted and transformed, in populations as far apart as Native Americans and modern Europeans. This is the part of the story that upends the usual assumption. The mutation for blonde hair did not evolve in a blonde-haired homeland waiting to be discovered. It evolved among a Siberian population with no direct connection to Northern Europe at all, and it had to travel an enormous distance, carried by descendants and migrants over thousands of years, before it ever reached the region we now associate with blonde hair almost by default. The next chapter of the journey runs through a group known as the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, populations that lived across parts of what is now Russia and Ukraine after the Ice Age. Genetic studies of ancient skeletons have found the derived Kitlig allele in hunter-gatherer remains from sites in the Samara region, from Ukraine, and notably from a site called Motala in Sweden. Individuals who lived roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago and who carried a genetic profile connecting them back toward that earlier ancient North Eurasian ancestry. In other words, the blonde hair allele had already made its way into hunter-gatherer populations well before farming reached most of Europe, but at this stage it was still scattered, present in some individuals and absent in others, not yet the dominant regional trait it would become. The real turning point, the event that took a rare Siberian-derived mutation and pushed it toward becoming the defining hair color of an entire region, came with one of the largest population movements in European prehistory, the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age. Beginning roughly 5,000 years ago, groups broadly associated with Yamnaya ancestry moved out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe and expanded deep into Europe, contributing enormous amounts of new genetic material to populations that were already a mix of earlier hunter-gatherers and the Anatolian farmers who had arrived in the preceding millennia. These steppe migrants carried substantial ancient North Eurasian ancestry themselves, and with it, elevated frequencies of the blonde hair variant. When they mixed with the populations already living across Central and Northern Europe, particularly groups associated with the later corded ware culture, the result was a new, blended population in which the genetic components for blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin were, for the first time, frequently found together in the same individuals, in the same communities, at meaningfully high frequency. It is worth being precise about what that means, because it is easy to collapse this into a single tidy sentence and lose the actual mechanics. Blue eyes trace their ancestry primarily to Western hunter-gatherer populations who were already living in Europe well before farming arrived. Pale, depigmented skin owes much of its spread to the Anatolian farmers who migrated into Europe from the Near East, bringing agriculture and, with it, genetic variants suited to lower UV absorption needs in a farming-based, less meat-heavy diet. Blonde hair, meanwhile, arrived on a completely separate migratory track, carried by populations descending from ancient North Eurasians and pushed westward by the steppe expansion. 3 different traits, 3 different geographic origins, 3 different migratory histories, converging on the same populations in Northern and Eastern Europe, only because those regions happened to sit at the crossroads where all 3 ancestral streams eventually overlapped. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and light skin are not one signature. They are 3 separate signatures that happen to stack on top of each other in one particular corner of the world. Why did the trait persist and even intensify once it arrived, rather than fading back out through ordinary genetic mixing? Several explanations have been proposed, and none of them are fully settled, which is itself an honest part of this story. One long-standing hypothesis ties lighter pigmentation generally, including lighter hair, to the reduced sunlight of high-latitude environments, where lower melanin levels may support more efficient vitamin D synthesis in skin exposed to weaker UV radiation for much of the year. This idea applies more directly to skin than to hair, since hair itself does not synthesize vitamin D, But some researchers argue that the same genetic architecture and selective pressures that lighten skin in northern latitudes may have dragged along linked variants affecting hair color as a secondary effect. Another explanation leans on sexual selection, the idea that a visually distinctive and comparatively rare trait, once present in a population, can spread simply because it is noticed, preferred, and selected for as a mate choice, independent of any survival benefit at all. Both explanations remain debated, and it is entirely possible that the real answer is a combination of the two, along with the ordinary effects of genetic drift in the smaller, more isolated populations that occupied northern Europe in the millennia after the steppe migrations. What is not in serious dispute is the geography of where the trait concentrated once it arrived. Blonde hair reaches its highest frequencies today in the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and parts of northern and eastern Europe, the same regions where the descendants of steppe-derived, corded-ware-associated populations settled most heavily, and where genetic isolation over subsequent millennia allowed the trait to climb to unusually high frequency rather than being diluted back down by continuous mixing with darker-haired populations to the south. There is one more twist to this story, and it is the part that makes blonde hair genuinely remarkable rather than just a regional curiosity, because northern Europe is not actually the only place on Earth where naturally blonde hair exists. On the other side of the planet, in the Solomon Islands, part of Melanesia in the Pacific, somewhere between 5 and 10% of an otherwise dark-skinned indigenous population has strikingly pale, sometimes almost white blonde hair. For a long time, this was casually assumed to be the result of contact with European traders or colonists mixing into the local population. Genetic research proved that assumption wrong. A study published in the journal Science in 2012 compared the genomes of blonde and dark-haired Solomon Islanders and found that their light hair was strongly associated with a completely different gene, TYRP1, involving a specific amino acid change that impairs the enzyme's normal role in melanin production. This variant sits at a frequency of roughly 1/4 of the Solomon Islands population, is recessive, meaning 2 copies are needed to actually produce blonde hair, and critically, is essentially absent everywhere else on Earth outside of Oceania. It has nothing to do with Kittilg, nothing to do with ancient North Eurasians, and nothing to do with the Siberian lineage that produced European blondism. It is a separate mutation in a separate gene that arose independently in an isolated Pacific population, converging by pure evolutionary coincidence on a visual outcome that looks, at a glance, remarkably similar to what happened on the far side of the world in northern Europe. That is the detail that turns this from a regional genetics footnote into something closer to a genuine biological rarity. 2 populations, separated by an entire hemisphere, with no shared recent ancestry driving the trait, arrived at the same visible outcome through 2 completely unrelated genetic pathways. Nature, it turns out, found more than one route to the same destination, and it did so without any contact between the 2 groups that ended up looking, superficially, alike. So when someone with blonde hair traces the trait back, the honest answer is rarely a simple one. For the overwhelming majority of blonde-haired people today, the true origin is not Scandinavia, and it is not any single northern European homeland. It is a small regulatory mutation that first appears in the genetic record in a 17,000-year-old individual from southern Siberia, carried forward by eastern hunter-gatherer populations across the steppe, and then pushed into Central and Northern Europe by one of the largest migrations in prehistoric human history, where it fused with blue-eye ancestry from an entirely different population and pale skin ancestry from yet another, to produce a combination that modern eyes have come to think of as a single, unified look. It never was one thing. It was 3 separate ancient populations, 3 separate genetic histories, and one enormous migration across the Eurasian steppe that happened to bring them all together in the same place at the same time. Blonde hair is not where it looks like it came from. It is a record of a journey that started in Siberia and ended, thousands of years and thousands of kilometers later, on the shores of the Baltic, with an unrelated echo of the same trait quietly waiting on the other side of the planet the entire time.